I have a theory that there's only one human being on the planet. I call that human being Homo originalis. But that this human being, when it's faced with a choice between A and B, it chooses both A and B. And having chosen A, when it's faced with a choice between C and D, it chooses C and D. Or having chosen B, when it's faced with a choice between E and F, it chooses E and F. And therefore that the 6.5 billion of us are merely 6.5 billion different personifications of the plethora of possibility residing in what it means to be human. And we mistake this. It's like a human body. You have about 100 trillion cells in your body, 10 to the power of 14 cells in your body. All of them came from an original cell, one single cell, a zygote, which split in 2 and then 4, then 8, 16. And at some stage, groups of those cells began to cluster and specialize. So a whole bunch of them clustered and became eye cells. Another group clustered and became kidney cells. Another group clustered and became skin cells. But you could take the DNA from any single cell in your body, from saliva, from blood, from your skin, from your kidneys, and if you extracted the DNA, you could totally recreate Pat Burns from it. All the information is there. But they have specialized into these different groups. Now, it'd be really foolish for kidneys to attack the eyes in the belief system that they're, totally different beings. They're not. They're the same entities which have just specialized. So by the same token, I believe whether my skin is yellow or it's black or it's red or it's white or whatever it is, groups of human beings have specialized as males, some specialize as females, groups of human beings have specialized as Chinese, others have specialized as Sudanese, some have become Catholics, some have become Buddhists, but they're specializations of cells of what it means to be human, but they're all the same. So if you could extract the essence of any human being on the planet, and by that I don't mean their biochemical DNA, I mean the God stuff inside in them, you could recreate the entire human experiment, because there's only one of us. And therefore for any group to begin fighting with any other group for religious reasons, economic reasons, territorial, political, military reasons, is literally an autoimmune disease where the body does not recognize that it's simply one finger inside in a glove fighting with another finger inside in the glove because they've been pushed into a glove where the colors of the fingers are different from each other. So all warfare is a failure to realize who we really are, and all violence is, and all discrimination is, all prejudice is, all bias is.
So why do you think that happens? Why do you think man does that?
I think this planet here that we live on is an extraordinary little planet. Now it's only one, in my belief system, of millions and millions of planets throughout the known universe which have thrown up intelligent life form. But there's something about this planet where we get to experience limitation, and limitation brings prejudice, and prejudice gives the opportunity of breaking through prejudice. So for instance, to use a metaphor, if you take a little child who's had chicken pox and a little child who hasn't yet had chicken pox, they're both chicken pox free. One has kicked it and the other still hasn't contacted it. But they look the same, but they're very different, because this kid who hasn't got chicken pox yet is always liable to get it, so they're never safe. The other kid is not going to ever get it again. Now, I think the whole point of experiencing prejudice is that when you encounter prejudice and break beyond it, you make a quantum leap in loving. If you haven't yet encountered prejudice, you may be without prejudice, but you're prejudice prone. You're going to learn it from the culture at some stage. So when we come onto this planet, as we come in here, as spirit beings, we have no gender, we don't have ethnicity, we don't have socioeconomic status, we don't have IQ level, we don't have religious affiliation, we don't have any of these confining and limiting, boundaries. But when we come into this planet, we have to make decisions. I have to decide, am I going to be born male or female, white or black? Am I going to be born to a rich family or poor family? Am I going to be born with a genius IQ this time or retarded? So all of these limitations immediately create prejudices for us. But it is in order that we break through the prejudices and really learn to love. And so, for instance, a little infant and an enlightened Buddha, they look the same. They're both prejudice-free. They're without prejudice. But this little creature is going to learn prejudice, sure as shooting, and we'll have to contend with it. This being has encountered prejudices and gone beyond them. So they're both prejudice-free, but one is pre-prejudicial and the other is post-prejudicial. So we confuse them, we think they're the same, they're not, because this guy has broken through it and this little kid is still to meet it. So the reason for this religion, the reason for the unrest, the reason for the illusion is that it gives us the opportunity of growing into who we are rather than just starting from a place of already accomplishing it. It's like the difference between if you go to play a game of golf and you've been assured somehow that every shot you hit will result in a hole in one. No matter what you do, you can hit it backwards and somehow it'll roll into the hole. There's not a whole lot of fun in playing golf. You know, it's when you got to learn how to master the craft, and then you get a hole in one. Or you go around in 76 or whatever. That's an achievement. So, yeah, it's coming in, taking on the limitations, learning the prejudices which are part of the limitations, and then breaking through the prejudices. That's what enlightenment consists of. It's the breakthrough that creates enlightenment. And so we're on safari. It's a very young experiment.
But if we are spirits, why do we go through this?
Because even spirits need to evolve. Souls, I said to you a few minutes ago that I believe that there are young souls and old souls, that it's the accumulated experiences of incarnation on maybe many different kinds of planets or life forms that allow souls to develop and to grow. Like they're like baby gods, you know, who don't know their divinity and have to grow into their divinity. And it's by experiencing different situations that happens. And so there are people on the planet right now, you know, who are really advanced souls, and there are a lot of us on the planet who are somewhere in between, and there's a whole bunch who are very, very young at the game. And we're all creating the drama which is affording every one of us at every stage of the spectrum the opportunity of improving our game a little bit.
Some religions call this a place of test. Do you see it as a place of test?
I see it as a place of test, not in the sense that there's a kind of there's a reward or punishment, that there's a God up there saying, okay, you know, you got to run the mile in, you know, 3 minutes 44 seconds in order to qualify. It's not about that. It's, I think we set ourselves life circumstances so that we become the kinds of beings we want to become, but there's no God up there assigning rewards or punishments to the process. And there's no God creating obstacles to kind of trip us up. I'm totally convinced that every single one of us, before we come in, we create what I call a preconception contract with a group of souls to create a world drama which affords every single soul 3 possibilities. The possibility for self-development, the possibility to help others develop themselves, and the possibility of raising the entire consciousness of the planet itself. And that's our function, a tripartite function. But that we pre-plan our drama. We come in with a cohort group of souls. We're going to safari with them through an entire lifetime. They will come into our lives no matter what we have to do to meet them. I don't believe in coincidence and I don't believe in luck. I believe that we bring into our lives the people we've pre-contracted to be part of. And it's to set up a drama in which every player is the star. There are no superstars in this drama. Everybody is on stage 24 hours of the day. Everybody is the center of the drama, of their own drama. But we're, you know, assisting actors or supporting roles to the other people in the drama, so that every single one of us has the ideal, optimized opportunity to do what we've come to do and learn what we've come to learn.
So in relationship to that, where do you see, what message would you most like to get across to your readers with your book?
What I would like to get across is that what I've been trying to do in this book is to try to mine or harvest the great scriptural traditions of the world for their mystical core, so that we can go beyond the metaphorical language in which they're being articulated, or the kind of the cultural environment out of which they grew, or particularly the literalist, fundamentalist interpretations of what they mean. That's what's getting us in trouble. But when you go to the core of the Buddhist scriptures, or the Hindu scriptures, or the Hebrew scriptures, or the Christian scriptures, the Taoist scriptures, you're making the very same core mystical stuff. So for me, the task has been, and the kind of my passion has been, to try to mine these systems and find out what is the mystical core of all these things. Because when you get down to that place, there are no theological differences at all. There are no liturgical differences. There are no ethical differences. You're at bedrock. You're at the water table from which all the rivers of the world are sourced.
How has your life as a Catholic priest affected this message, or how you're delivering it?
I think I know that I'm a Catholic priest this time around. This is my mission. It's my family. I don't believe in the Catholic Church as an institution. I'm not interested in it at all as an institution. That's totally superfluous to the Catholic family, which is my birthright this time. I know I have been Hindu in past lives. I've been Jewish in past lives. For me, my purpose this time is to start with a home base of Catholicism, and from that place invite Catholics to experience, experiment, and survey the great mystical core of all the other traditions. My training as a priest in theology and scripture, my living as a priest in Africa for a long time, and living here in the States as a priest for a long time, it's given me the opportunity to take aboard what is really beautiful about Catholicism. There's a deep mystical core to Catholicism. There's an extraordinary environment that Catholic liturgy creates, particularly for me around Eucharist, which it creates a kind of a numinous state, a place where I literally can sense and feel the divine. I think the Catholicism has an extraordinary ability to create great symbolism. I don't agree with a lot of Catholic dogma, but dogma for me is not that important. No teacher never asks us, no great teacher ever asks us to believe anything. They ask us to act with love, but not to believe in a whole bunch of dogma. Dogma is totally superficial to the process. The Companions on the Journey is a group that was founded on the 1st of June 1997. It was a group of mainly liberal Catholics, many of whom had been disillusioned with mainstream, organised, bureaucratic Catholicism, who were trying to create a community for themselves where they would have charge of their own liturgy, they would have charge of their own theological thinking, and they would have charge of their own community organisation. So what we've been doing, while it's basically a Catholic Eucharist, our theology is very eclectic. The community members come from Catholic, Protestant, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim backgrounds, Jewish backgrounds, so there's a big mixture. I would say 80% of them probably are Catholic, but there's 20% from other systems, so there's a great cross-fertilization of theologies there. Our method of self-government is more a Quaker model. It's a consensus model, so there's nobody in charge of anything, which means everything bumbles along very slowly, but everybody's view is equally important. And when decisions have to be made, they're not made if there's anybody who feels differently. And we stay with the process as long as it takes until everybody can live with the decisions. So there's no hierarchy, there's no bureaucracy, there's nobody in charge. I just happen to be the spiritual director for the group, but I have no mandate whatsoever organizationally. I'm not in charge of the group in any sense of the word. I don't tell anybody what to do. And there's nobody in the group who is in charge of it. It's a consensus-driven model.
But you're the leader.
I'm the spiritual director I'm not the leader of it. I'm the spiritual director for the group. So in actual fact, I'm an independent contractor whom this group has asked to preside over the liturgies, the Eucharist, and expose them to good theological thinking. And that for me is the function. I don't have any organizational function whatsoever or no leadership role in it.
You say Mass in an Episcopal church and a Seventh-day Adventist church for your community. Why do you say Mass, or why don't you say Mass in a Catholic church?
Okay. I'm persona non grata in the diocese in which we're situated. I don't belong to the diocese, so it's not a big deal for me. But I worked in association with the diocese for about 8 years after I had come out of Africa. And in 1995, I was told by the diocese that they no longer wanted me. My theology was too strange for them, too difficult for them, and they told me that I would no longer be welcome to use any Catholic facilities for any liturgical functions again. And so we went from a Seventh-day Adventist group on Sundays and from an Episcopal group on Thursdays and Fridays. And for me that's great. It means that this is, we're a pilgrim church. We don't have any real estate or any of the headaches that brings with us. And there's also the metaphor of being a pilgrim people who doesn't own a space but is trying to create God energy in a few different locations.
Kind of like Janis Joplin saying, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose.
I like it. Yeah, brilliant.
Right?
Yeah, right.
Can you enlarge upon what you mean when you say in one of your homilies, life is not what happens between birth and death, life is what happens between incarnation and enlightenment?
I would actually even expand that at this stage, because I believe there is only one life, and life exists in a pre-incarnated form, in an incarnated form, and in a post-incarnated form. And the one life that moves through, for instance, this person you're interviewing today, who lived before he had this spacesuit and will live after he's had this spacesuit, it's the same life that you have. So there literally is only one life. It is the God experiment, wherever it's happening, whether it's happening on planet Earth or it's happening on planet Vulcan, whatever it's happening, it's only the one life. And in the case of a single soul, that one life, exists in three kind of, in a cyclic stage, in a pre-incarnational stage, in an incarnational stage, and in a post-incarnational stage. So I want people to begin to think that it's not just birth to death doesn't represent life, it represents just a stage in the mission, a stage in the safari, but life has existed long before I was born and long after I shuffle off this mortal coil. And so real life is the passion for mission. That's what I meant by that phrase, that real life is the passion for the mission. And that mission started the moment I said yes to conception, and that mission only ends when I reach enlightenment. And in fact, I think it may not even end then. There's a notion within Buddhism called the Bodhisattva. And the Bodhisattva is the enlightened being who's worked off, their own personal karma, don't need to come back at all for their own continued evolution, but who choose to come back until every sentient being is saved. And so I think, in fact, that while mission may begin at conception and end at enlightenment, in actual fact it goes beyond enlightenment. It goes on until every being has reached enlightenment. So it's not just between individual conception and individual enlightenment, it's between individual conception and enlightenment for everybody. Nobody finishes this race until everybody finishes this race. I remember hearing a story a few years ago about a Special Olympics, and the Special Olympics is going to be held in Ireland this year in a few weeks' time. A Special Olympics event for kids. It was like 100-yard dash, although dash was a kind of a euphemism for what happened. And there's 20 or 30 kids of all ages, from 15-year-olds to 30-year-olds. Most of them are Down syndrome children. And the gun goes off and they all stumble forward to run up the course. And one little fella falls and starts crying, and he's looking at his shin, and his shin is bruised. And the whole group turns around and they look back at their fallen fellow, and they stop the race, and they all go up back and pick up this little kid, and they link arms and they walk up the entire track and go over the line together. And the entire stadium stood up and just gave him a standing ovation. Now, I think that's what life is about. Life is about all sentient beings crossing the finishing line together. So I don't believe in such a thing as individual salvation. Nobody gets to heaven until everybody gets to heaven. So the old Christian notion that part of the joy of heaven was that we got ringside seats looking down at the agonies of the damned, that for me is the worst contortion of the teaching of Christ. Nobody gets there until we all get there.
So if there is these multiple lives, how come we can't see our past lives?
There are many, many ways of seeing a past life. I mean, how much of your first 6 months on planet Earth do you remember right now? Almost none of it, probably none of it. And some of the most important things that ever happened to you happened during that first 6 months period. So the fact that we don't have conscious access to experiences doesn't mean that these experiences haven't largely formed where we are. So even if I were to say to you, what were you doing on the 1st of July 1979? You probably couldn't tell me. We don't have conscious access to most of our life experiences.
My personal digital
Check it out, brother. Check it out. But all these things form us. They fashion us. They're the reason we are who we are. Every thought, every word, every action we've ever performed, every experience we've ever had has been part of the formation of the personality that we now reside in. So there's 99.9999% of our life experiences is consciously unavailable, to conscious access, but it forms us. So that's the first thing I would say. So all the information from past lives, in fact, has informed us and is part of the reason we are who we are. So in that sense, we have unconscious access to it constantly. Now, I also think that it's like with computers, subsequent generations of computers have hardwired into them what previous generations of computers needed by way of software. So subsequent generations build upon the learnings, and we incorporate that into the hardwiring of the new systems. So I think in subsequent lifetimes we have hardwired into us all the learnings of the previous times. So the fact that we don't have conscious access to much of this information doesn't mean that this information isn't profoundly affecting who we are and how we're responding to stuff.
Is humanity getting better?
I believe so. I really believe so. And the measure of it is the extent of the crisis we face. As I look at human history, in some senses, the only difference between the violence we're experiencing now and the caveman experience was that it's much more difficult to do international damage, with a cudgel than it is with an intercontinental ballistic missile. But the anger is the same, or the selfishness is the same, or the fear is the same. So at one level, we're being driven by the same kinds of fears and the same kinds of anger, except that now it's being wedded to a much more lethal technology. But at the same time, the level of consciousness that's been happening on this planet is extraordinary. When you look at, human rights, women's rights, even recognition of animals' rights, all these realizations, they're very, very recent in our history. The humans themselves were maybe 1.3 million years old as an experiment on a planet that's 4.5 billion years old in a universe that's 13 billion years old. But even within the human experiment, it's only for the last 2,500 years, literally, the last second before midnight, that the great avatars have been coming among us. The Buddha figures, the Lao Tzu figures, the Jesus Christ figures, the Socratic figures, only the last 2,500 years. So the great, great teachers have only begun to come very recently. So we're very young at this experiment. But even in that period of time, we've made extraordinary progress. And the fact that we're facing an extraordinary crisis at this stage, for me, is evidence. Because as I look at evolutionary history, even on the planet itself, there's never a significant shift in functionality which is not precipitated by some kind of a global crisis. This happens in evolutionary biology all the time. I see it as a psychologist when I'm working with couples or individuals. Nobody makes a significant shift in their level of functioning unless it's occasioned by some kind of a personal crisis. And we're facing a planetary crisis simply because we're being invited as a planet, not only the human species, but the consciousness, the sheath of consciousness surrounding the planet itself is being called to the next evolutionary shift from mind to soul. We've gone from stuff, just being physical stuff, which we study through physics, to being a life form studied by biology, to being intelligent beings studied by psychology, and the next part of the shift is being souls, which is studied by theology, and finally spirits, which is studied by mysticism. So we're on the brink of the next two phases as a planet, and that's why the crisis is happening. Otherwise we wouldn't be making the shift.
How do you think that your message will help the people of the world?
I would hope that, I think a teacher's function, as I said before, is not to tell people stuff they don't know, it's to awaken them so they remember stuff they know at the core of themselves. My hope is that if enough voices are articulating truths that people know at the core of themselves, if enough people are doing it and are networking, that eventually a critical mass will be reached. And a critical mass may be less than 10%. You don't need a majority in order to make a huge shift in thinking. You need a significant minority is enough, often less than 10%. So if there are enough teachers on the planet, helping to wake people up to the realization of what they know really deeply, and those teachers are networking, those groups are networking, there's going to be an extraordinary shift in consciousness. And I'm adding my 2 cents to that process.
You live in one of the most affluent areas on the planet from a materialistic point of view, and maybe from a spiritual point of view, I'm not sure. How does that compare to your endeavors in Africa, and what do you see that's happening here in that comparison?
I think America has an extraordinary opportunity. As one of the things I began to say very, very strongly after the 9/11 incident, that America, given its extraordinary resources, not just its physical resources, not just its wealth, but its brain power, its freedom of rights, to assemble, to think, to talk, was being given this opportunity to spearhead human evolution. For me, the pity has been that those in political authority chose to go back to a level 2 religion and even a level 1 religion, unpredictable, uncontrollable, distant, demanding deities visiting their anger, on people who perpetrated this crime against us. We were being offered this extraordinary opportunity to think differently and to lead the thinking, to bring together what I would have loved to have seen in the wake of 9/11 was to have declared a 5-year moratorium on retaliation. and bring together the great spiritual leaders, political leaders, military leaders, economic leaders, ecologists, psychologists, medical people, agriculturists, to have a 5-year-long meeting to brainstorm as a species as to how we could do life on planet Earth differently. And then that would be legislated for, instead of just going back to Era 1 religion or Era 2 religion, which is that of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So the great crime for me in our subsequent history is not so much that we bombed a whole bunch of people into extinction in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. That wasn't the great crime for me. The great crime for me was that we blew resources and time when we could have been spearheading the evolutionary shift that we've delayed. We lost a few years in the process. And the great invitation, and the reason I'm excited to be living in this country at this time, is that we do have the resources, we do have the freedoms, we do have the intellectual power to be able to create a paradigm which will allow the human species to break through into Christ consciousness. And we have the technology of it, for it, we've got the freedoms for it, we've got the resources for it. So for me it's a really exciting time to be alive, and it's a very exciting place to be alive. I couldn't be doing this work in Africa, I couldn't be doing it in, in the third world.
And why is that?
Because I wouldn't have the resources, the technology, or the audience who's capable of making differences in the world. I could change local communities. I get to talk to people, who are heavy hitters where I live. And technologically speaking, even politically where I speak. I've had, people from the American government over the years, George Shultz in the audience at one stage, when I could talk to people at that level and introduce spiritual thinking, there's a possibility that that can translate itself into American political, domestic and foreign policies. When I'm in a village in Africa, I'm dealing with the local community, helping to provide water and food, and I'm changing the local environment, hopefully for the better, but it's never going to make a huge impression on what's happening at a global scene. Here, I can be a factor in that.
So when there are catastrophes like you were talking about, or dangerous situations that we go out of control, we tend to swing back. Are those, where do you see the best change opportunity, on the swing back or as we're going off into an aberrated direction?
I think as we go off in an aberrated direction, even the ones among us who are asleep begin to realize that things are getting so bad so quickly that instead of letting it up to the leaders to make decisions for us, we have to figure out if the leaders aren't doing it and seemingly can't do it, then we need to rouse ourselves and organize ourselves. So in this the aberrant swing for me is a wake-up call. And so part of me thinks it's like there's a brinkmanship happening here. And I felt, before we, for instance, went into Iraq, I had the feeling that if the peace movement succeeded too quickly, it would prove its own undoing, because we'd just all go back to sleep. If, the war happened and devastation happened, we'd gone too far and lives were going to be lost. So the ideal would have been some kind of a brinkmanship where it would get serious enough for enough people to wake up that they would remain awake forever, but that it wouldn't have to translate into, the death of a lot of innocent people. We transgressed that boundary somehow. But my hope is that, because things are getting so bad, more and more people are going to wake up, and they'll wake up sufficiently to stay awake and not just wake up until the crisis is over and then go back to business as usual.
There's a lot of religions out there who hold, or modern religions, who tend to be more scientific, who tend to shun the concept of God, as though, it's like they've run away from God, but they take a lot of their teachings from the religions. Are you familiar with any of these?
Yes. I think these people misunderstand what science is about, and a lot of scientists misunderstand what science is about. So there's a notion now called scientism, which is an aberrant form of science. In the same sense in which you've got fundamentalist religion, you've also got fundamentalist scientism, which isn't good science at all. Science should be open to investigating the data, and on the basis of the data, recognizing patterns, setting up hypotheses to explain the patterns, setting up experiments to test the hypothesis, and then building models that work. Scientism doesn't do that. Scientism, for instance, would believe that only the material world is real, and if something isn't material, and if it can't be empirically validated by my instrumentation or by my 5 senses, it doesn't exist. So scientism is totally closed to investigating a whole realm of human experience. So for me, that's fundamentalist science. It's really bad science. Just like there's fundamentalist religion, which is refuses to accept the findings of real science. So in the past, the fight has been between fundamentalist religion and scientism. The wedding needs to happen between a mystical religion and good science. And when you bring those two together, extraordinary things happen. I did for my doctoral dissertation, I did a study, an experimental study with 496 people on the effects of intercessory prayer at a distance on self-esteem, anxiety and depression levels in a population in this area. And there was an area where I'm trying to bring together the best of real science, random controlled, double-blinded experiments with an esoteric phenomenon of intercessory prayer. You can do that. When you bring good science together with mystical thinking, then you've got an extraordinary synthesis. When you bring fundamentalist religion together with scientism, then you get just an extraordinary fight with each group accusing the other of being blinded. And
There's great things from my past that I don't think I ever really understood. One is prayer, and the other is sin. Prayer conjures up all kinds of menial tasks and things like that. I'm totally misunderstood on prayer. What is prayer?
For one thing, there are lots of different kinds of prayer. Most people, when they think of prayer, excuse me, they're thinking of petitionary prayer or intercessory prayer where you're asking for something. Now, in fact, that's only one kind of category of prayer. There's prayer of praise, there's prayer of thanksgiving, there's prayer of adoration, there's prayer through meditation. But most people are going to think about prayer of petition, so let me concentrate my response on that. Prayer of petition, where you want a specific outcome and you pray to some God to affect that outcome. Now, when I was doing this prayer study, I investigated a few different notions on prayer. There are some people who think that prayer of petition or intercessory prayer is merely chatting about the inevitable. Even if God exists, since God is omniscient, presumably God has factored all pieces into the equation, including the prayer which is to come, 10 years down the line. And so there's not going to be any change because God has factored in all the pieces and He's come up with the equation. So prayer petition is just, you're wasting your time. You're chatting about the inevitable. God is going to do what God is going to do. No, I don't think that's real. I don't believe in that. There's an idea that prayer petition is like, I call it the satellite dish model. So there's my brother Seamus living in Ireland, and I want to pray for him. And so because of the curvature of the earth, I can't pray for him directly. So I got to bounce my prayer off God like a satellite dish in the sky, and God directs my prayer right down to Seamus. So God is some kind of an intermediary bouncing my requests onto their targets. Now, I don't believe that's true either, but a lot of people operate with that model. There's a model that I call the Abrahamic model. It's the model that you can argue with God. There's the great story of Abraham arguing over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah and saying to God, if there are 50 good people in these cities, are you still going to destroy them? And God says, well, if there's 50, I'll save them. What about if there's only 45? Okay, suppose there's only 40. You got a deal. Suppose there's only 30, 20. He goes right down to 10. So there's some people think you can argue with God, you can bend God's arm and get what you want. And I don't think that's how prayer works. There's a notion I call the Mosaic model. There's a story of Moses in the desert where the Israelites are having a battle with the Amalekites, and Moses goes up on a hilltop and he's got his hands raised and he's appealing to God to help his side. And as long as he can keep his hands in the air, the Israelites are winning. But his hands get tired and they begin to droop, and then the Amalekites begin to win. So two guys come, one on the left hand side and one on the right, and they prop up Moses' hands, and then the Israelites win. Now, there are some people who think there's some kind of a trick to prayer. If you can figure out what the trick is, you get what you want. So it's a pilgrimage to Mecca, or it's the 9 First Fridays, or go to Lourdes, or whatever, as if there's a trick to the process. I don't believe there's a trick to it at all. So what's the metaphor that works for me? I think of prayer like a sprinkler system in a lawn. So you got all these underground pipes, all connected to one faucet. And the faucet is the source, God's love for us. But this love, the water, flows through the entire system, and is sprinkling the lawn, which is human life. But there's a nexus, there are nexus points where the pipes join, and when they get clogged up, an area of the lawn gets denied water. The sprinkler in that area isn't going to work because it's all clogged up. And what clogs it up? Prejudice clogs it up, unforgiveness clogs it up, bad theology clogs it up. And so the object of prayer for me is to free up these nexi, these blockages within the pipe system, so that the water which is within the system already is free to water the entire lawn. So prayer is not where we're bending God's arm. I don't think God is involved in prayer at all. I don't think prayer is about asking God to make any change in outcome. I think prayer is about human beings freeing the blockages in the water system so that people can benefit from our compassion. And so prayer is not about, I don't think prayer involves God at all. It's not asking God to intervene at all. It's human beings. I call it laserized intentionality, where our consciousness, our mindfulness, and our prayerfulness allows the blockages within the system to be dissolved so the water can flow freely to its targets. And I don't believe that prayer involves God at all. We're not kind of, appealing to a transcendent entity to intervene in human affairs and change an outcome. But since we're all built in God's image and likeness, in fact, we are praying to God. We're trying to access inner divinity. Except for most of it is really difficult to do that. So we create symbols outside of ourselves in order to try to focus what's within. But most of us, we project this image outside in order to focus, and then we think the action is out there. It's like when you're watching a movie. If you project, a movie onto a 40-foot by 40-foot screen, and then you think that John Wayne is actually riding across the stage up there from left to right, and you take out your gun and start shooting at him, as we used to do with kids. We'd be throwing stones at the screen, where in fact the action is happening up in the projection box. It's all up there. But it's very hard to see a movie up there. If you're looking at, inch by inch celluloid frames, is a real boring way to watch a movie. So by projecting it onto a screen, we get the illusion of change and of time and of speed and of size. It allows us to see very clearly up there what's back up here. But if we think it's happening up there, we're deluding ourselves. So when we pray to God, it's to help us to focus on an image of something that's within ourselves. But if we think it's outside and we're praying to an entity who's going to intervene from the outside, we get it wrong. So it's an aid to self-realization, it's an aid to becoming fully aware, it's an aid to laserizing my intentionality, but it's been driven from the God within me. And my target is the God within you, or the God within whomsoever I'm praying for.
So when you tie that to sin,
yeah,
it's almost defeating to your ability to project out.
Precisely. So my definition of sin is, I do not believe that sin is the transgression of precept. I do not believe that sin is breaking a law. It's only tangentially related to that. Essentially, sin for me is the conscious, deliberate decision not to grow. I'm faced with an opportunity in which I can act out of my divinity, in which I can radiate love and compassion in a situation, and I choose instead to identify with my ego or my persona, and therefore I choose not to grow. And that's what sin is. It then frequently involves, breaking a precept or transgressing some kind of a law, but that's tangential to the process. That's only the effect or the symptom or the epiphenomenon. It's not the core or the essence at all.
What about like stifling? Do some people get stifled in life because they don't know which way to turn, because they've been hit by too many things?
I think many people are overawed by law and by convention, by culture, by upbringing, and they're not, I wouldn't say not just not thinking for themselves, but not contacting their own soul wisdom, because there's a place beyond mindset, and that's soul set. There's a wisdom far deeper than our thoughts, and that's our spiritual knowing. But most of us have been taught to distrust that. We've been told to follow dogmas, to listen to teachings, believe in a whole bunch of stuff, and totally disregard intuition and native wisdom. When I watch little kids, from the time they're born on, they're absorbing the phenomenological world. They're drinking in all of this extraordinary, awesome experience, and they ask great questions. But at age 5 and 6, we send them off to school, we ignore their wisdom, and we fill them up with data and information. Now, data and information, they just allow us to manipulate the external world, but they don't bring us in alignment with our truth. That's what wisdom does, that's what soul does. And kids instinctively know that until the education system, makes them distrust that. And then religion picks up on education and continues it into our adulthood. It continues to tell us to distrust our intuition, our wisdom, our soul sense, and to listen instead to revealed dogma and to the church belief system and a whole bunch of ethical norm.
When we talked about living in this society and having the tools to do it, I remember in 1974 I had a chance to go to the Soviet Union, and I sat in a circus, and the and we're drinking beer and having fun with all the Russians, and they knew we were Americans, and we had a great time. And then out came the propagandists, and they made fun of the Americans and the Germans, and everybody in the circus just went dead quiet, and they sat like robots. And it was very amazing because nobody was having fun with us anymore. And the moment they stopped, everybody went back to having fun. Nobody said a word. And I realized at that time was very interesting that in the Soviet Union, well, we think of them as being suppressed and that they don't get the truth. That they had a better idea of truth than we did because everything they heard from the source they knew was going to be wrong. And they were very well informed and they had a very good idea of where the truth was. Whereas figured in this country was one of the reasons why I went into this business, but I'm the effect of it too now. The people here really have a much less sense of where the truth is because of our overwhelming freedom and that anybody can say anything they want.
It's a great point, Pat. I agree fully with you. It's a much more subtle form of propaganda. And I think the result has been that, when I think of having lived in Ireland for the first 26 years of my life and in East Africa for the next 14 and here now for about 17 years, that this culture has an extraordinary ability at self-deception. That because life is so good and we have so many freedoms that we believe our own lies much more readily than the Soviets, as you said, believed there. They knew it was propaganda and they tuned it out and then went back to business as usual. We've taken it aboard because it's been far more subtle and therefore the damage has been much more devious because we can't recognize it and therefore we're not, it's hard for us to do something about it. Yeah, I agree with you.
Do you, I mean, this is a very materialistic place in the world. How do you see that affecting our spirituality here?
I think it is a very materialistic place in the world, and at the same time, I don't know of any people, segments of the population particularly, who are more aware of, interested in, and involved in rights and, equalizing opportunities for the world's population. In many places in the world, people are so involved in just the kind of the daily grind and survival issues that they don't have the resources or the time to spend on thinking a bigger picture. At least there's a subgroup within this culture who are well enough off to have the leisure time and have the training and the expertise and the resources to begin making a change. I think there's some extraordinary people in this area, really extraordinary. In spite of the fact that they're often well-to-do, they're using their material wealth, as resources to try to make changes globally. And that's part of the excitement. There's a lot of people here across who are just trying to get richer and richer and, on the backs of many people getting poorer and poorer.
What would be your ultimate goal from your book?
I would love to think that I could be part of a networking group who are waking up people to the realization that this is a game and we're playing the wrong game. Some of us think the game is prestige, some of us think the game is politics, some of us think the game is wealth, and none of these things are the game. The game is to see, can we remember? The game is to see, can we wipe out the amnesia for who we really are? And the game is to see, can we cause to evolve on planet Earth a species capable of recognizing its own divinity? And I would love to be part of that movement, to wake up enough people so that this movement result in a consciousness shift for the whole planet, and that it would affect then everything we do, from our politics to our agriculture.
Do you believe in evil?
I do, in the sense that there's a shadow part of every single one of us. Now, Carl Jung defined the shadow. He said the shadow is 80% gold, unlike Freud, who believed that, in some senses, the unconscious was the repository for all, the suppressed traumata of our lives. I don't believe that's true. I believe that's only part of the truth. There's maybe 20% of the shadow of the unconscious which is filled with, the darkness of the trauma of my experience in life. The other 80% is unrealized potential. If I'd been born in a different family, maybe I would be encouraged to be a musician, which I'm not. If I'd been born in a different family, maybe I'd been encouraged to be, an ice skater, which I'm not. The family I was born in was interested in academics, so I kind of majored in that. So there's all these parts of us which never get developed because of the particular family we're born into or the culture we're part of. So what is evil? Evil then, I think, is unrealized potential and the frustration that comes out of that, and the failure to deal with our own egocentricity. And if I don't deal with my own egocentricity, I'm going to have to project it onto somebody else, some other person, or some other segment of community. Now, I think we do this as individuals, and we do this as communities, and we do it as cultures, and we even do it as a global community. And so there's a whole bunch of constellated, unacknowledged shadow material which the entire species, has dissociated from, and that's polluting the consciousness sheath around the entire planet. And it's almost, I had a vision a few months ago in which I saw the universe as a pregnant woman, and she was hugely pregnant, and I was watching a silhouette, and she was pregnant with planet Earth. And I could see the expectant mother. Sometimes she looked vibrant and healthy, and sometimes she looked really wan and listless. And I came to the realization that instead of there being a single umbilical cord connecting the planet to the universe, there were 6 billion umbilical cords, and there was liquid passing through these cords. And I noticed that the quality of the liquid influenced the health of the mother. And I came to the realization that it's every human being on the planet is connected to this consciousness sheath around the planet. And we're being sustained by it, and we're also feeding stuff back into it. Because the umbilical cord does two functions. It feeds the baby, where the mother sends nutrients in, and the baby eliminates through the umbilical cord back into the mother, and she gets rid of the waste matter on behalf of the child. So if our thoughts, or our words, or our actions are violent, then we're sending all of this toxic material back into the womb and back into the membrane, which should be feeding us, but we're polluting it and poisoning it, and so it's unable to sustain us anymore. And therefore, evil for me is that unresolved stuff, which is then the energy which influences selfish decisions that individuals make, communities make, nations make, and the global community makes. So when we become conscious of that, then we need to do 3 things. I need to watch the quality of what I think, I need to watch the quality of what I say, and I need to watch the quality of what I do. And to make sure that I'm not putting violence out there, I'm not putting judgment out there, I'm putting compassion out there. And then as this membrane receives more and more compassion from inside, it becomes more and more capable of nurturing us, and then the evil dissipates. But until we realize that as individuals, as communities, as nations, we keep just projecting our stuff onto others and then punishing them.
Tell me what makes you most excited.
Right, sure. I remember in April about 1978, in a deep, deep meditation, having a vision in which Christ was crucified, died, rose from the dead, and then was recaptured and re-crucified. And then a whole group came out the second Sunday to watch him rise from the dead as a spectacle, and it never happened until the whole crowd went away. And I was sitting there in my vision alone when he rose the second time. And he said to me in this vision, he said, "Who do you think disappointed me the most?" And I said, I suppose it was Peter. Peter was allegedly the rock on which you were going to build your church, and he denied 3 times that he even knew who you were. And Christ said to me, "No, it wasn't Peter. Peter did what he did because he was afraid, and I could understand fear." So I said, "Well, if it wasn't Peter, it was Judas. Judas was one of the 12, and he sold you for money." And Christ said, "No, it wasn't Judas. Judas put a lot of cunning and a lot of craft and a lot of commitment into what he did. It wasn't he." So I said, "Well, if it wasn't Peter, it wasn't Judas, it was the high priest. The high priest was, he was the scripture scholar, he was the leader of the spiritual movement. He should have recognized the Messiah when he came, and instead of that he crucified you." And Christ says, "It wasn't even he. He stuck to his guns. And when I rose from the dead the first time, he crucified me again. No, it wasn't he." And I said, "Well, if it wasn't Peter, it wasn't Judas, it wasn't the high priest, I give up. You tell me who it was." And he said to me, "It was the mob. The bored, listless, mediocre mob. All they wanted to do was be entertained. It didn't matter whether I was feeding them, miraculously, or I was dying on the cross, or I was rising from the dead. They just wanted to be entertained. They could care less about what I had to say. All they wanted to do was entertainment." And I would make the same response. What disappoints me most, it is that the vast bulk of us are just mediocre. We're neither hot nor cold. We're not doing a whole lot of damage, and we're not doing a whole lot of good. We're just meandering through life in this soporific state of half awakeness. That's the crowd. It's not so much the leaders, the people who are kind of leading us into hell in a handbasket. At least they're bringing power and passion and commitment to what they're doing. It's the people who just could care less, just drifting through life aimlessly,
Is that a result of fear?
I think it's a result of a few different things. I think often people in power work at that. Used to be an old statement in Rome, way back at the time of Christ, that the crowd would shout out, panes et circenses, bread and circuses, give us bread and circuses. You know, as long as we've food in our bellies and we've entertainment, we could care less what you guys do at the top. And leaders know that. And they know that if you can kind of give people bread and games, you can do pretty much what you want. So leaders throughout history who have agendas, whether they're political agendas or religious agendas, they've learned that if you can satisfy people's basic needs to entertainment and food, you can do pretty much what you want with yourself. Yeah, and lead them anywhere you want. And so I think it's been cynically manipulated by leadership all throughout human history. Somebody said to me one time, you know, can God forgive everything? And I said, no, God can't forgive anything. God is the only person in the universe, to use an anthropomorphic term, who can't forgive and who doesn't forgive. Because in order to forgive, I first have to hold a grudge against you and then subsequently let go of it. And since God, as the ineffable ground of our being, is totally incapable of holding a grudge, God is the only person who can't forgive. Forgiveness comes from inside each other. So it's very interesting to me that, for instance, in the holiest day in Judaism, you know, at the end of the year, when before the book is being closed, that there's a ceremony called the Kol Nidre. And Kol Nidre is people acknowledging their misalignment. But none of it is about offending God. There's not a single statement in that entire liturgy about offending God. It's all about offending each other, because you can't offend God. You can offend the God in somebody else, but you can't offend the transcendent, ineffable ground of our being. And so forgiveness is never a question of asking God's pardon for having upset her. Forgiveness is always coming to the realization that all sin is about a failure to grow, and that failure to grow affects my relationships, affects my culture, and affects my world. And therefore, those of whom I need to ask forgiveness are my brothers and sisters. So all forgiveness is about the acknowledgement of the misalignment I've created between myself and my essence, and between myself and other selves. But I can't be misaligned from the ultimate ground of my being.
You refer to God as she. And in your book you refer to that man minimalizes God by trying to quantify God. But you call her she.
The only reason I do that is kind of for the shock value, in the sense of that anything anything we say about God is metaphorical. Every single thing we say about God is metaphorical. Even to ascribe being to God is already to introduce human categories which are meaningless when you're talking with the ultimate mystery. And therefore, if you're going to talk in metaphors, and you're going to talk about a loving metaphor particularly, I will use female images to balance the kind of the preponderance of male images where we think God is a father. So if father love is a metaphor for how God loves us, equally so is mother love a metaphor for how God loves us. And so to try to redress the imbalance and get people thinking that it's all metaphorical language anyway, I will often use female pronouns in speaking about God. I think, for instance, when Christ instituted Eucharist, that of all the symbols he could have left with us to talk about how much and how committed his love was for us, that he chose an intensely female symbol. Eucharist is about feeding us from his own body and blood, which is what a mother does with a child in utero. She's literally feeding a child from her own body and blood. And when she births her child and nurses her baby, she's still feeding the child from her own body. And so here's this extraordinary symbol of mother love. So if we're going to insist on using metaphors for how God loves, then why not use a whole bunch of metaphors? And so I'm using this to kind of just balance the equation a little bit. But it's all metaphorical. Yeah. So for me, this is one of the saddest things about being a priest in the Catholic system, that for me, Eucharist was probably the most single healing thing Christ ever did in his life. Much more healing than the people he raised from the dead, much more healing than the cripples he raised or the blind to whom he gave sight, because Eucharist was the end of exclusivity. It was Christ inviting in everybody from the highways and the byways, men, women and children, into this banquet of God's table. So it was the end of exclusivity and elitism. And to be told as a Catholic priest that I have to exclude from that banquet people who are divorced and remarried, or gay people, or people who are not Christian, this for me is totally meaningless. It is totally meaningless. That the essence of Eucharist is its inclusivity. That every single one of us is equally beloved of God, and we're all called to this banquet table. And if Eucharist is a symbol of the love that God has for us and the fact that we're all equally beloved of God, one of the things we do at our community, on every Sunday we tell people, everybody here today is welcome to receive communion with us, because every single one of us is equally beloved of God, and this is symbolic of how God feeds us. So it's really upsetting to me to think that the single greatest teaching about inclusivity has become the criterion for exclusivity in Catholic teaching.
A lot of the things the church does is counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
They make rules to have you abide by some path, but in the course they create guilt from violation of those rules, and through the guilt people go further off the path.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's self-defeating. You're shooting yourself in the foot, because what you're retaining as part of the fold people who are obedient, and you're losing from the fold people who are creative. The ones who could really bring the system forward into its mystical core are the ones who are being forced out of the system, and the ones who are just concentrating on the roots, and maintaining the status quo are the ones that are being retained. And we've done that as churches throughout history. We've lost our greatest creative thinkers, we've lost our greatest mystics, we've often inquisited them and killed them, in order to retain the superficiality of belief system. There's a great Islamic story, a Sufi story, about a guy living somewhere on the borders of Afghanistan. And every week he'd load up his donkeys and take them across the border. And every week the soldiers at the border would stop him because they were convinced he was smuggling stuff. And they would search the bags that were on the donkeys, and he'd look in the donkeys' ears and open the donkeys' mouths. And this was going on week after week after week, and he'd go backwards and forwards with the donkeys. And they never figured out what he was doing. And he was smuggling. He was smuggling donkeys. Yeah. And I think that's what we're doing here. I'm trying to smuggle donkeys. I'm trying to go into a place where people think that they're there to be entertained, and I'm going to smuggle in a donkey. And the donkey is some kind of truth and some kind of being awake. And if only one person in the audience finally gets it, that this is about donkeys, there's nothing hidden there, the donkey is what's hidden, and one person wakes up, that's enough. So I think there are two huge differences between somebody who's passionate in a cause and somebody who's fanatical about a cause. And the first difference is a sense of humour. Fanatics have no sense of humour. They can never laugh about their stuff. Somebody who's passionate about it can. And the second big difference is a sense of time. I think if somebody is passionate about God's work, then it has to be God's timeline. And if I insist on imposing my timeline on the process, then it's my stuff. It's my agenda and it's my ego. It's not God anymore. And so allowing it to happen at its own pace, doing my damnedest, but then letting it happen at its own pace, and viewing both my efforts and the results with a sense of humour. Yeah, we have to laugh at ourselves. And
the Catholic Church doesn't laugh at itself very well, does it?
Nope. Organizations have a terrible sense of humour.
Can you put that in a sentence? Now I'm putting words in your mouth.
Yeah. I remember one time the Dalai Lama was out here visiting, and he came to St. Patrick's College in Menlo Park, and he was being led in by the then Archbishop of San Francisco. And as he was coming in, he's smiling. The guy smiles all the time. And I heard somebody who was present there, where the Archbishop was deadly serious, was processing in with all solemnity, escorting his guest, and this guy is beaming from ear to ear. And the comment I heard from somebody who was present was, as the Archbishop came in, the impression you got was, I am an important person. And the impression you got from the Dalai Lama was, you are important people. So he was laughing and smiling in awe at his audience, and the other guy was totally self-engrossed at his own importance. And that sums it up for me. If I can't laugh at myself and be in awe of others, rather than be in awe of myself, and despise others, I have no idea what spirituality is about.